Hey everyone.
Hello.
Welcome back to Bad Marriages in the Bible. I am Sean.
I'm Kate.
And together we are your hosts.
We run Dandelion Ministries, which is about creating space for you to experience the grace of God in your place of need with art and music and podcasts like this one, even in bad marriages.
That's right. That's right. And if you want to find out more about us, you can just go to dandelionministries.org and you'll learn more than you probably bargained for. Just kidding. But we are doing our Bad Marriages in the Bible show, and that means that we are looking at the different relationships in Scripture that showcase the grace of God.
Yes.
They highlight the areas of need in our lives because they're just normal people like you and me. And their relationships are often the arena in which their brokenness comes out.
Yes.
So we are broken lovers. That's one of the ways we like to describe sin is people don't like the word sin, but it really just means that we don't know how to love the way that we really want to or the way that we want to be loved. We are broken lovers. And so we see that playing out in relationship.
And perhaps the entire profession of psychology is a proof of that.
That's right. Yes. The reason why you go to a therapist or just your friend to confide and do all that wonderful stuff that we love to do, to talk to somebody else other than the person we actually have the problem with, is because we are broken lovers and we need support to navigate the sometimes very confusing waters of relating to someone different from us.
Yeah. That's why this text actually is so ahead of its time. We're going to jump into Genesis chapter 15 and 16. And this was before emotional intelligence was really named or popular.
Everybody in the Bible was an emotional idiot.
Well,
No.
we'll see the text actually has a very high value for each member of this story.
Yes.
Even the powerless one, especially, I would say, the powerless one, which is the slave, woman, Hagar.
I always say Hagar, by the way.
Hagar, yeah.
I'm influenced by the appropriate pronunciation because of Van Halen, which all of you would know, Sammy Hagar.
Yes.
Not David Lee Roth. Obviously, David Lee Roth is the true frontman for Van Halen, but Sammy Hagar did a good stand-in job for a while, and so we say Hagar in the rock world.
I support it, but I tend to say it's an open A.
Yes,
so we'll
she
see.
does. She says, I think we've talked about this before maybe, but she says tomato.
Yeah. Let's move on.
And we're moving on. So Hagar.
Well, we had talked about a big sort of whoops episode last time where Abraham had felt super stressed out by this amazing encounter with God, and God had called him to follow him, but it had stressed him out. And so he turned to a coping mechanism that actually violated himself and violated his wife.
Yes.
In order to cope with that stress.
Yes. Pretend you're my sister.
And so here, after that, and we saw how God intervened, and it was God's own zeal and his own faithfulness that restored Abraham and Sarah, forgave them because he didn't cast them off. He's still with them. And the next chapter, in chapter 15, he reiterates that promise that had stressed Abraham out so much. He reiterated it by casting his eyes towards the heavens and looking at the stars and saying, Abraham, really, even though I know you're barren, but your cousin is not going to be your heir. Your own child is going to be your heir. And in fact, you are going to have so many children that it will be like the stars of the sky.
That's right.
And then he gave him an even greater promise involving some sacrifices of animals and God passing through them in the form of a burning torch when he had put Abraham into a deep sleep. And that was an ancient way of making a covenant or a promise, saying, I am promising on my own name, and I am going to keep this promise that I've given to you. And even if you break the promise, I'm going to take the punishment for it. I'm going to make sure to keep that promise.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, he actually says to Abram very, very clearly when he interrupts his life again and says, Abraham, fear not, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. And he's promising Abram that he's the one that's going to have his back. That when he comes up against things, when he comes up against problems that are too big for him to solve, that God is going to be the one that bails him out, that brings him through, that provides a way. And so that's his promise before he reiterates the idea of his descendants outnumbering the stars. And then, as Kate said, this covenantal way was one where you actually would cut some animals in half, and then both parties would walk between them, symbolizing that if either one of us breaks this, then we will have the same fate as these animals. So sorry, PETA, but that's the way things worked back then. And God puts Abraham to sleep, and he's the only one that passes through the animals. And it is, again, another foreshadowing of Jesus, where in Genesis 3:15, we heard that the serpent would strike his heel, but he would crush his head, and that implied that he was going to have to suffer a little bit. The striking of the heel sounds like a little bit. This one expands that and shows that he was actually going to pay the ultimate price, to actually die for the broken covenant. And so that's the promise that comes to Abram right before we have another wonderful, terrible episode of Abram and Sarai still. They still haven't had their names changed by God yet. But before they come up with another really great idea.
Yeah.
Or bad idea. And
this one is quite bad.
It's quite bad.
This one is
So the first time we heard Abram, his thought was, I'm stressed. We're in a foreign land. You're super hot. Sarah, I need to figure this out. I know. I'll prostitute you out to the Pharaoh. Great idea.
Yeah.
And so that was his first solution.
Yes.
And now here, God reiterates this promise. And even in Abram, it says Abram believed him, and it was credited to him as righteousness, which is what all of Christianity hangs on. As we continue to read through Scripture, and if you know the New Testament, St. Paul will hang everything on that statement. That it's about faith and not about works, not about what you do or don't do. It's about a promise being given to you and you believing that promise. That comes from this passage. And that's the thing that happens right before Sarah comes up with her great solution. So what is that solution, Kate?
Yep, that's true. So Genesis 15 is what we've just been talking about.
Yes.
God's promise to stay with sinners and to take the punishment upon himself.
Yeah.
And stay with Abraham. So that's Genesis 15. And now in Genesis 16, it is Sarai's turn to come up with a lack of faith idea.
Right. Here we go.
She is freaking out about this. I'm sure Abraham told her about the reiterated promise about God making their offspring like the stars in the sky.
Yes, and it's important to note the reason why she's freaking out is because Abram is now in his 80s. Time is not slowing for these people. They are continuing to age, and God keeps telling them they're going to have a kid.
Yeah, and he continues to wait on that promise. He's fine with that, but they keep getting older, and she's like super post-menopausal right now.
Yeah.
And so in Genesis 16, it shows Sarah's real lack of faith. And this time Abraham goes along, just the way Genesis 12 showed Abraham's real lack of faith, and Sarai goes along. This time it's the counter point of that. And so she is saying to Abram, I'm going to prostitute you out, just the way he had said that to her with Pharaoh. And now she says, I have an Egyptian slave. And why don't you take Hagar?
There we are. Excellent.
Why don't you take Hagar to be your wife? And lay with her and have a son through her.
Yeah, not to be your wife, just to be your, I think he says just to be your woman.
Could be mistress, but it does say in verse 3.
Oh, as a wife. Sorry, I missed it.
And he gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife.
You're right.
So, she finds God's promise so impossible that she thinks this must be the way. And sure enough, Abraham takes that opportunity.
I was going to say,
that's
Abram,
not such a bad idea.
Standing there like Adam in the garden, It's a wonderful repetition here where he's like, yeah, that's not a bad idea. Like that looks good as well to me. So he went along with it, and surprise, surprise, and didn't object after he had all that faith, apparently, in the previous chapter. And this again is it's gonna talk more about what faith actually is here when we're seeing that our actual ability to believe rises and falls.
Yes.
But it's really the promise. Faith is all about what the promise is.
That's right.
and whether it is going to remain true.
That's right. In fact, this actually, we're going to just pause here and challenge the new Indiana Jones movie that is coming out. And we just saw the preview for it. And we're all crossing our fingers and hoping that it's good. And
it's going to be great.
It's going to be
It's going to be great. But yes, the tagline that they've highlighted in that preview, he says, it's not, I've learned after seeing this is an aside, I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan, but after seeing the Ark of the Covenant swallow up Nazis, and then seeing the Holy Grail heal his father and all this wonderful stuff, he's like, I've seen a lot of things. I don't believe in magic and all this, but I've seen a lot of stuff. And he's like, so anyway, he says, it's not what you believe, but how hard you believe it that really matters. And it's like,
yes.
Okay.
So now we have the opposite here. So perhaps Abram has a modicum of faith, just a tiny bit, but it's in who it is in that matters.
That's right.
And even the tiny little bit that he has been given to him, and it will not be taken away.
Yeah.
And so
again, he was asleep when God made the covenant and passed through the animals. Like, that's an important thing to remember. He was sleeping.
And so if you've ever felt like God is far away or that he doesn't care about you or see you, we have this story where it's entirely his initiative that is coming to Abram, coming to Sarai, and now coming to Hagar and saying, I see you and I want you and I'm going to stick with you and I'm going to open your eyes of faith to see me, even in the face of the impossible.
That's right.
So that's what this text is showing us.
That's what happens. Abram knocks up Hagar, and this is how it plays out. In case you didn't know, when you add another person into a marriage relationship, it gets more complicated.
Yeah. We were musing to ourselves that, we really don't see a lot of divorce back then because their definition of marriage was so much looser. There was concubines
in the sense
and
of being
polygamy.
Instead of being restricted to just monogamy.
Yes.
They're like, we don't need to get a divorce. We'll just add some more.
But the text is going to show that this always hurts.
Yes.
It always hurts the wives, ultimately the husbands too, and it hurts everybody involved.
Yeah, there's always collateral damage.
So the text is showing us this. So when, and it goes on to say in verse 4, and when she saw that she had conceived, so when Sarai saw that Hagar had conceived, Hagar looked with contempt on her mistress. So finally, this powerless, slave woman finally has a little bit of power. She is pregnant and her mistress can't be, and she is taking her revenge. And I think we can relate to that, and even in this day, the minority finally comes to power and you want some revenge. So I don't fault Hagar, but that is what's happening. And it's also a not of the Lord, and it causes a reaction. And Sarai gets so mad at Abram, and she's saying she is looking with contempt. She's holding this over my head that she can have kids and I can't. And may the wrong be done to you. The wrong that I'm experiencing, may that fall upon your head, Abram.
Yes.
And so she blames Abram for this whole altercation here and all of the jealousy and the contempt that's happening. It's Abram's fault.
Yes. Well, just in terms of the mechanics of it, he definitely was the one who did the deed. And so she's got a point. But it is wonderful how that repeating of the Genesis plays out here. Wonderfully terrible. That she immediately starts to blame him.
Yes.
And say that it was all his fault when it was all her idea. And it just shows how it backfires. So often our solutions backfire. And the thing that we are desperate to prevent ends up happening. I don't know if you've experienced that in your life, but I certainly have. When I'm freaked out about something or trying to control a situation, oftentimes the thing I'm trying to prevent happens anyway, and usually because of my best efforts. And that certainly happened here with Sarai.
Yeah.
And Abram, who was being the kind of go-along, codependent, whatever you say, honey, thing, people-pleasing, wife-pleasing, and just, read between the lines, all you guys out there, selfish, like, sure, why not? I'll sleep with this other woman. And which is terrible, but he did. And Hagar also suffers because of this. And the thing that happens is when Sarai says all that to him, like, throws it all in his face, he again does the same thing he did in the first time, which he just goes along with it. And he's like, oh, you're right. And he favors Sarai, right? He starts to push away Hagar, who is now pregnant with his child.
Yeah.
So now he's
abandoning his son.
Yes.
And he's abandoning, his what they had thought originally would be a solution to their problem. But now he is abandoning this woman that he's brought into his loving arms.
Yes. His loose skin. And anyway, he's like an 86-year-old dude. That's what it says. He's 86 when she gave birth.
Yeah.
Hagar.
Yes. And so that's a real tragedy, and the text shows that. And it is an advocate for Hagar in here, and it is sitting on all of the brokenness here. The Sarai and Abram are refusing to take responsibility for their actions, and Hagar's revenge, is also laid bare there. Yeah. And then Abram's avoidance.
Yes.
You know what you're saying. He avoided. He was codependently going along, but also avoidant. And in sort of recovery language, we talk about wax and lax when we're talking about abuse that you have encountered or even given. And we see here.
Right. A whack is when you actually are actively hurt by someone. So it's like getting hit.
Yes.
And then a lack is when there's an absence of something that you needed. Yes. So both hurt and they both equally traumatize, especially people think that the whacks, meaning like I was hit when I was a kid or I was abused or, any of that kind of stuff, that those are often worse, people often think. And I'm not saying they're not, they're terrible. But a buildup of lack in your life is equally as damaging.
Yes.
If you have if you had a lot of needs as a child and they were never met and there was neglect or something like that, then that is equally as traumatizing.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. And so we see both of those in this short paragraph, which is pre-emotional intelligence. But here we have it in this ancient Hebrew text, that there are whacks happening back and forth between Hagar and Sarah. And Sarai, it ends the paragraph with, and Sarai dealt harshly with her, so harshly that Hagar fled from her.
Yeah.
Fled the regular meals and the shelter and the protection of Abram. It was worse for her to live with Sarai treating her harshly.
Right.
It was
then to try to go figure it out in the desert somewhere.
In the desert, yeah.
Right.
So she goes out to go die in the desert because Sarai is being so bad. And Abram is doing a lack. He is just absent,
Totally neglectful.
Towards Hagar. And perhaps Sarai is, she's so mad at Abraham because he's also not engaging with her and not sorting out the problem together with her. And so she's frustrated with his avoidance.
I'm sure she was. She was frustrated for many things.
Yeah. And so, but we see in the midst of this, where there is just dysfunction everywhere, and the text is showing the sin that is by all parties, that God is the intervener. And he is the mediator, and he hasn't forgotten his promise. And he's not really fussed by all the sin that he sees flying around. And he is able to intervene and to redeem.
That's right. Remember, he's the one that said, I will keep this covenant. I will be the one to protect this promise. because I'm the promise giver.
Yes.
And so he jumps in here and sends an angel to Hagar, who's running off into the desert, right?
Yep.
And
she's by a spring of water in the wilderness.
Yes. And an angel comes to her and says, you're pregnant. You'll bear a son. You'll call him Ishmael. And the Lord has listened to your affliction. And then Hagar's response to all of this, and he says some interesting things about Ishmael. He's going to be like a wild donkey of a man. So anyway, I don't know what to say about that. But he says to her that God has heard you. And her response is that this is a God who sees me. That's what she says. She says, I now know that he sees me and knows knows my pain and cares about me and is saving me in the midst. And so the angel tells her to go back to Abram and Sarai.
Which is, suicide unless you have an advocate with you.
Right. Yeah, it sounds terrible. And but Hagar listens. And that, again, is another moment of faith that is born because of a promise, like Kate just said, someone who's going to be with you, a God who sees you, a God who knows you. And that's faith only and ever, always exists because of the promise. It's not something you drum up. It's not something that has strength because of your effort, like Indiana Jones said. The strength of it has everything to do with how strong the promise giver is. And so Hagar is able to go back.
That's right. And God, the text, it slows down too. When the angel comes to her, he asks her, where have you come from and where are you going? And he obviously knows the answer to that question, but he's saying it for her benefit, to slow her down and to help her own what's going on. And she tells him, I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarah.
Right.
And so in that moment, he's helping her to own what her part is. And he's also saying, by bringing her back to Abram and Sarai, the Lord is saying, you can't just sweep this under the rug. I saw this.
Yeah.
I saw this, and you are going to deal with this, and you are going to help her raise her son. You are going to get them to the point where, her son's going to be okay, on his own, kind of 11 years old or so. And we'll see something else terrible happens later. But God brings them back under Abraham's shelter and protection in order to raise them. And you see that God sees everything and has exposed this sin and is Hagar and her son's advocate, and also Abram and Sarai's, because he's not forgotten his promise. He's not going to cut them off from it. He's going to stay faithful to them, and it's going to be in light of their sin, not by sweeping it under the rug.
Right, exactly. He's the Redeemer. I mean, this is the thing. What we saw in Genesis was that his first response to sin and to brokenness and to our best ideas is to redeem, to heal, to promise to bring something good out of this. And that's what we see him doing with Abram and Sarah, is that he is redeeming their big mistake. He is going to bless Hagar with this child, and he promises that he's going to be actually a great nation as well. So that's an interesting thing. By periphery, the promise that was made to Abram about his and Sarah's child that will come actually spills over onto Hagar and Ishmael in that way. And we see God's just incredible faithfulness, as Kate's saying. And it's not going to get simpler. It's going to get more complicated, as Kate hinted at, as we go along. And we will return to hear how it plays out between them in our next episode.
And I think just to end this section too, since it is back to this story that all those three major world religions trace their origins.
Yes.
And so the Muslim faith would look back to this episode and say, Ishmael we are Abraham's children through Ishmael,
Mm-hmm.
and the Jews certainly through Abraham and Sarai,
Mhm.
Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, and Christians too look back to this, but we would see it as a place with faith
The faith.
and God's promise to Abraham with that vision of sacrifice and that burning torch and taking the suffering upon himself would be fulfilled in Jesus Christ,
Yes.
who is the mediator between God and man.
Mm-hmm.
And you see God mediating between God and man all through this passage, being a mediator between Abraham and Sarai and Hagar. And that we would say is the very spirit of Jesus, foreshadowing the real man who would come later.
That's right. Yeah, God is he's the guy that is keeping them all from killing each other. And so that is wonderful. Praise
Well done.
God.
Well done.
Well done, God. All right. Now we are going to change gears and shift over to our question and answer segment.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to pick up with another part of the question we addressed last week from our friends in San Francisco. And it is, what does the Bible say about conflict in marriage and forgiveness and being triggered by your spouse?
You will definitely be triggered. You will definitely have conflict.
Yes. So that's one thing the Bible says is like, expect it, right? We had a mentor years ago that said, John Stanley, who said, when two people get together, expect conflict. And so that's one of the guarantees you've got. And so what does the scripture say about it? We thought it was an appropriate one for this story that we're talking about today, because we do see a lot of conflict in this interesting love triangle.
There's a perfect triangle, really.
It's a perfect triangle. Sarah was like, this is just not enough people. Let's bring another one in. But Abram, his way of dealing with conflict, let's say this first of all, was that there was a conflict, even though it was unspoken.
It's the impossibility of that promise.
Yeah, the promise was a problem, and they were both coping with that in some strange way. We talked about Abram's way of
Be my sister.
Yeah, be my sister, and her way of saying sleep with my servant.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a conflict here, and they weren't addressing it. So there was already an issue. God was telling them one thing. Abram had heard it. He knew it. He believed it, we were told, and yet he still goes along with Sarai's idea. And so that is an important thing to acknowledge, that there is a conflict, even if you're not addressing it and not speaking about it. Doesn't make it go away.
And this is in the context of Abraham already believing God and it being counted to him as righteousness.
Right.
So all of this, my granny used to say, and I say it too, I've been a Christian my whole life. So I've done all my sinning as a Christian.
That's right.
And that's what we see. We zero in on Abram and Sarai's life after they become what we would say now Christians.
Believers, yeah.
Believers in this God who's revealed himself to them. And so we're seeing all their sinning in the context of that covenant relationship with God.
Right. Yes. And we see Sarai's fear saying, we need to do this, and Abram's avoidance, right? So we see Abram's kind of default setting, at least with Sarai. He may not do this with other people, but when it comes to his relationship with Sarai, who is his main squeeze, his number one, he doesn't speak up. So he's repeating that pattern we saw with Adam, and he just goes along with what she says. And of course, he was probably a horny old man, so he thought that wasn't a bad idea in the first place. But that's his way of dealing with the conflict. He's just going to be like, hey, okay, whatever you want to do.
Right. He does that twice in this passage.
Yeah, he does it twice.
He sleeps with Hagar at her instruction, and then he also says, do whatever you want with Hagar, and abandons Hagar and his son.
Right. So that is one of the main ways we see his dealing with conflict, which is maybe the conflict will go away if I don't disagree.
If I avoid it.
Yeah. But it is still there. And Sarai's is, she gets more aggressive in this one. She was more compliant when he said, you be my sister. At least the scripture doesn't tell us she fought back on that or pushed back at all. In this one, after the tension mounts with her and Hagar, she gets aggressive and says, you, Abram, it's your fault. You did this to me, you big putz.
That's right.
And then he retreats again.
Yes.
And so there is a lot of conflict here, and they're not dealing with it. First of all, by acknowledging it, really.
Yes.
By just saying, we've got a problem here.
And that is, I think, the big point we want to sit on is becoming aware of the conflicts that you are already in.
That's right.
We are all in a conflict.
Yeah.
And we're all probably in a little fight with God in some way.
Yes.
And it helps so much. I am not somebody who's very self-aware. I need a lot of help to become aware of my emotions at this time. And it so is helpful to have your patterns described. And there we see the wisdom of God, having all of these relational patterns written down, even in an age that was before emotional intelligence was popular.
Yes.
But yet here it is written down, those triangles that are causing stress in the relationship, the different ways they're coping with fear, and the ways that they're dealing with conflict of fighting or of that flight of avoidance. And so having our conflict patterns described is so helpful. And that has been very helpful to me in becoming self-aware in ways that I'm coping with a conflict. Two other things that are helpful in hearing patterns described are to name your resentments. Where are you getting resentful right now? You see it in this passage. Sarah's very resentful of Hagar. Hagar's very resentful of Sarah.
Yes.
She's finally like, I have the upper hand on you, Sarai. But there are resentments in this passage. And that has been a very helpful way for me to realize where I am entangled in sin and where I am angry and I'm not even aware of it. And where I'm holding that over Sean's head or somebody else's head, and where the source of my anger and what I'm doing to numb out. So I've talked about becoming aware of your conflict, your pattern in conflict. I've talked about naming your resentments. And the other thing that helps in developing self-awareness is, where are you making vows? Where are you waking up in the morning and saying, I'll never do that again?
Nowhere. I always do everything right first time.
That's right. Where have you said, I've got to stop doing that?
Yeah.
Being impatient with a child. That's one that I've said that vow about. Where I feel ashamed, that you'll hear those vows. So where are you saying those things to yourself? And those are aids to help you become self-aware of where there already are conflicts happening in your life and where you need a mediator, where you need God to bring that to, he's already bringing that to light through this.
That's the triggering. The part of the question that says when you get triggered or when you trigger your spouse is that's actually, we hate them. We hate them and we run for the hills and we try to avoid them at all costs. Thank you, wine and Netflix, right? But
yes,
we try to not get triggered or feel them or run into problems. But the triggering is actually one of those severe mercies of God in the sense that he allows them, puts us in relationship with people that are gonna push our buttons so that, like you just said, everything can come to light. Oh my gosh, this really ticks me off. Oh, this makes me feel this makes me feel that. And it usually is tied to some pain that you've carried for a long time that you learn to cope with. And God is the God of healing. He's the God of redemption, like we said. He's bringing redemption in the midst of all this. He's showing us himself through relational conflict. That's what Scripture is full of, because he's showing us that he's the one that can actually heal the rift that started in Genesis 3. And that we feel on an everyday basis. And so that's just an important thing to realize that is the trigger, and the trigger is okay.
In God's hands, it's actually a helpful thing.
Yeah, it's needed, because otherwise you just stay numb. You
just keep repeating these patterns over and over again until you die an unhappy death in an unhappy marriage.
That's another good point, like what you just said. I think it was your first point about the growing in self-awareness and kind of realizing what the conflict is. that's something that I've learned in my own life, and then I've counseled others in and watched happen in other people's lives, is they start to notice a pattern. I have a relational pattern.
Mm.
This has happened. This happened with my sister. This happened with my mom. This happened with, my first girlfriend. Now I'm on my third wife, whatever it is.
Mm.
And you see this keeps happening.
Mm.
And that is also a very good indicator. And it's a helpful one to wake up to what is happening and why you keep handling conflict this way.
Yes. And forgiveness is God intervening and bringing his forgiveness first and foremost to us personally, is the main thing that will intercept that shame cycle and say, I see this. I am the God of seeing. I see this pattern. I have known it since the day you were born. And I know it's hurting you and it's hurting other people too. And I know you're stressed out of your mind. You don't know what to do. I see it and I forgive. And I am for you. And I'm not going to walk out on you, and I'm not going to give up on you.
That's right.
And that forgiveness intercepts that pattern, first and foremost for ourselves, and then it'll bear fruit. And it can reconcile any relationship.
Yes.
Any sin in marriage can be forgiven and reconciled. These passages in the Bible, they stay married and there is reconciliation. We don't actually see much of it between the two of them, but we do see it between them and God.
Yes.
Because he's the one that continues to cycle back and give them even more layers of his promise to them, and signs and physical signs to show his faithfulness to them. But it can bear fruit and really heal marriages. But even if your marriage is past the point of no return, or you've never even gotten into such a dangerous relationship in the first place, there can still be healing personally.
Sure. Yeah. And I think one of the things, like we've said before, very few of us just welcome the mistress into the situation and we just keep on getting married to more and more people, as they did in the Old Testament. Most of the time when it gets to this point, there's a break, and it's often an irreparable break. But as Kate is saying, the Lord is the Lord of reconciliation, of redemption, and all things. And that context of safety that you're talking about, knowing that God knows, knowing that he's the God that sees you, that he's the one that has come and said, I am the one who's walked through the pieces of the animals. I'm the one that's going to actually pay for all of this. I'm going to make a way and heal and forgive, and you'll be free from any condemnation. That is the beginning of you feeling safe enough to actually venture into those dicey waters with somebody here in your relationships, right?
Yeah.
Like, I need to know that I'm going to be okay before I can actually face how bad things really are. And that's the context that God gives us. He comes and says, I forgive you. I love you. I promise to make you whole. And so that allows you to then take the risk of owning your side of the street in a conflict. And that's the thing, that reconciliation is possible in everything, because God has made it possible by healing the rift between us and him. But it does it takes both parties, really, when it comes to marriage or relationships here and now. If the other person is not willing to go there with you, then reconciliation is going to be out of reach until they're ready. But it doesn't mean that you can't take care of your side of the street. That's one of the things they say in recovery rooms. You can still walk in forgiveness for that person. You can still make amends as far as you're concerned. And you can hope and pray that they will come your way too and reciprocate. But even though there might be pain in it, there is still the potential and possibility of you being freed from that burden of carrying that and having that dictate your life.
Absolutely.
You're not living in resentments. As they say, resentment is poison intended for somebody else that you drink yourself. So that's the thing that forgiveness actually sets us free from and enables us to heal, even if our partner or the person that we care about so much can't go there with us yet.
And we've watched it in people, but it can become something so devastating, even as a broken relationship that can't be reconciled, as you're saying. But in God's hands, there can still be healing for those relational patterns that dragged you into this conflict in the first place.
That's right.
And you can have healing for those childhood wounds and those coping mechanisms that brought you into that place. And that is so life-giving that you'll come out even with gratitude for what God, the new life that God has brought.
That's true.
That is what we've seen in people. It's happened in our own life. And so there really is a mediator between us and God who is for you. And we see him in every sentence of this sad story that has a redemptive bent to it. And it's calling his name, though the New Testament gives it to us, and that he's the one who's for each of us now in the conflicts that we're facing.
That's right. That's good news. And we will definitely be revisiting these topics and themes as we keep going through bad marriages in the Bible. We're so grateful for these questions. If you have a question after listening and you want to send it to us, please do. The email will be in the show notes. And please subscribe to our show if you like what you're hearing. And tell your friends and family and everybody else to do so as well.
Tell your enemies.
Tell everybody. And we can help you reconcile with them, hopefully. But please do. And we are so glad that you listened. And we will see you next time.
Bye-bye.